Second part. A few minutes later, Mayor Ming was greeting a visitor in black. "Why didn't you tell me about the house?" The mayor recoiled from the serene tone in spite of himself. "What house?" "Where they found your daughter. It seems it was the home of the girl who's in the hospital. Lori." "That's right," the mayor said casually. "I didn't divulge that particular information because I didn't think it particularly vital. Did something happen?" "I don't know exactly what happened, but someone was in there. I believe they were looking for something." "What kind of character was it?" The mayor's eyes glittered with curiosity. "There's no point getting into it. Have any of the townspeople shown any particular interest in that house?" "Can't see how they could. The place is supposed to be locked up tight as a drum." "Do you know of anyone in town with a talent for molecular intangibility?" asked he. The mayor didn't answer. What was Lori Knight's family researching there? He was merely, the mayor began to say, but then he grew silent. A thin breath whispered from his lips. For the longest time, the Knight's experiments were the source of some concern for folks around town. Not their results, per se. It was simply that no one could grasp what they might be doing in there. As you're no doubt aware, in a town like this, it's impossible to try and do anything without somebody finding out about it. At times, individual egos have been known to endanger the way of life for entire communities. I personally called on them more than a few times, but Franz, the girl's father, always maintained they were simple experiments in chemistry. The mayor's face wore a heavy shade of fatigue. Saying not a word, Dee continued gazing out the window. As far as the eye could see, the brown plains bent away from them. The town's cruising speed, it seemed, was far from leisurely. "If only I'd taken notice sooner," the mayor continued. His voice was leaden. Mr. and Mrs. Knight were the town's foremost chemists. It was only Mr. Knight's intellect that saved us from famine 15 years back, or averted the Thunder Beast attacks in the nick of time a mere 4 years ago. If not for him, a good 70% of the town would have gone to their reward. I thought we could overlook their somewhat unconventional hobby, and the townsfolk seemed to feel the same way. That was a mistake. And then one day, he suddenly decided to leave town. Yes, it was just about 2 months ago. I tried my best to dissuade him, but his resolve was strong as steel. I can still recall the look on his face. He looked like flames were ready to shoot out of his eyes. I suppose whatever he discovered here in town could have served him quite well in a life in the accursed world below. He could have very easily come up with something useful like that. And I had no choice but to let them off. Of course, I didn't neglect to make it perfectly clear they'd never be allowed back in town. And that's all there was to it. I don't think it was, Dee said, as if conversing with the wind. There was something in their house that bordered on utter ruin. Anyone would notice it. Where did you dispose of the things that were in the house? There wasn't anything like that, the mayor said, fairly spitting the words. The only really unsettling stuff was some odd-looking bottles of medicine and 2 or 3 contraptions it looked like they'd thrown together. And we wasted no time in destroying those. but the rest of the drugs and machinery were sent over to other labs or factories that could make use of them. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all. Who did the actual work? Folks from all over town pitched in. Just check the names and you'll see. You mean to tell me you weren't involved? The mayor shook his head. No. I give the orders around here. I was right there when it came time to board the place up. Dee said nothing, but gazed at the mayor. His eyes were dark beyond imagining, and clearer than words could say. I'll need a list of everyone involved in the project. I want to ask them about something. Why? Do you think I'm lying? The mayor asked, not seeming the least bit angry. Anyone can lie. Dee replied. I suppose you've got a point there. Just give me a second. I'll make you a copy. The mayor used the intercom on his desk to give the command to the listing computer, and in fewer than 5 seconds the mayor handed Dee a sheet of paper. The names and addresses of nearly 20 men were recorded on the list. Putting the paper in his coat pocket, Dee went back outside without making a sound. Page break indicated by a small cross. The old room felt dirty. Aside from the industrial facilities, this place had more working machinery than any place else in the whole town. And after nuclear energy had been produced, the waste was promptly processed and dispelled as a harmless dust. Despite that, the room did indeed look somewhat soot-stained. A black figure crept over to the control panel that regulated the trio of nuclear reactors. Because the section provided energy for all the town's needs, it was protected by 3 Dewar walls, each 6 feet thick. All activity in the building was monitored by the computer. Nevertheless, the shadowy figure stood suspiciously before the controls, unnoticed by the electronic eyes and unrecorded in their memories. A black hand entirely befitting the dark figure reached out and began flicking off lights on the panel. Something that never should have been allowed. Page break indicated by a small cross. In the depths of the swirling chaos, red spots began to form. A few of these spots quickly fused into one, and from a spot it grew to a stain, and from the stain a net formed. Within the scarlet was her father's face. His expression was oddly calm. Blue light danced about him. The light was as bright as lightning, but at the same time it also looked somewhat like coral. Her father looked up from the table. Several seconds later, an elated hue spread across his emaciated features. Her father's lips moved. I've done it, he said. I've finally done it. The next thing she knew, her mother and father were wandering about in the wilderness. In the distance, the wind howled. It was a cold wind, as chilly as a fog. On the desolate plain before her there was nothing to see but clouds and sky. The clouds eddied, and the wind alone blew against her. And then that wind formed a face by her, one she felt she might have seen before, and yet at the same time she also felt she'd never seen. And there wasn't just one face. There was another, and this one was familiar. Its lips parted to speak. Stay. Just stay here. As she and her family moved across the biting, wind-blasted wilderness, she got the feeling that the voice echoed after them for an eternity. Exactly where her father and mother were trying to go, she didn't know. At times, her mother looked back over her shoulder anxiously, while she realized they'd seen nothing but desolate plains out there. Her mother seemed to be afraid of something gaining on them. What made the girl uneasy was the unfamiliar face that hung in the heavens. Its eyes focused not on her father or mother, but on herself. This the girl knew with every fiber of her being. The wind and bits of sand noisily struck the girl's face. Page break indicated by a small cross. Dee was in the park. Sitting on a bench, he watched the water leaping in the fountain before him. As always, his thoughts were a mystery. A black shadow suddenly fell across his profile. "Hey, are you Dee?" someone asked in a deep voice. Dee didn't answer. It was almost as if he'd expected the question. The man standing by the end of the bench was a giant who seemed to stretch to the clouds. Not 6 or 7 feet tall, but closer to 10. With a frame like a massive boulder with logs sunk in it for limbs, his shadow easily covered Dee and stretched to the base of the fountain several yards away. On the chest of his blue shirt there was a tiny, sharp gleam of light. Apparently not taking very kindly to being ignored, the giant continued. "I'm Sheriff Hutton. Keeping the folks here in town safe from unsavory outsiders is what I do. And it don't matter whether you're the mayor's guest or not. That won't get you no slack from me. You want to stay in town? You'd best mark your time peaceably and not go looking to stir up any trouble. See, if you put in 3 days on the job and have nothing to show for it, even the mayor will give up. I'm gonna be the one who goes looking for your stinking kin. I'll find him and drive a stake through his heart all proper like. Being sheriff, I don't much cotton to them ignoring me and calling in a punk kid like you." Hutton had a deadly piece of hardwood by his right side, a rocket launcher that seemed to consist of 7 barrels banded together. A piece of heavy machinery like that could blow away a large beast, or even a small building, with one shot. And stuck through his belt was a huge broadsword. Even without seeing his weapons, the average person needed only a glance at the size of their owner to start quaking in their boots. With just one look at the sheriff, some folks might even confess to crimes they hadn't even committed. "I want to know if you'll promise me something," the sheriff said. "Just tell me you'll leave town without doing anything. Don't worry. I'll tell the mayor you did your darndest to take care of business. You follow me?" There was no answer. The only thing about Dee that stirred was his hair, brushed by the wind. Vermilion started to tinge Sheriff Hutton's face. Slowly, he backed away. The business end of the rocket launcher he still had tucked under his arm jerked up. All 7 barrels glared blackly at Dee. "Don't think I'll give you any warning." The slight metallic click was the sound of the safety being disengaged. "I only give you the hint once. Ignoring it is the same as crossing me. And it wouldn't do the town a bit of good to let a fool like that go on living," the sheriff said, his voice cheery and his face bright. An icy tone mixed with the wind. "You were one of the people who investigated the night house, weren't you? What was in there?" "What the hell are you yammering about?" the sheriff said, his voice taut. But he didn't do anything. He didn't even move the finger he had wrapped around the rocket launcher's trigger. "Answer me," the voice said again. The hunter's eyes were still trained on the white pillar of water spraying upward, making it difficult to say just who was grilling whom in this bizarre scene. Neither of the two moved, but in the space between them an invisible but nonetheless fierce battle was unfolding. Strength surged into the sheriff's trigger finger. His weapon had been set to discharge all 7 projectiles at once. In a matter of seconds, the bench and the young man sitting on it would be reduced to ash by a 30,000-degree conflagration. The faint sound of a siren pulled the weapon's muzzle from its. Looking unexpectedly relieved, the sheriff's long face turned upward. Something more than just clouds resided in the azure sky. "Looks like the bastards have come for us. Damn, you're lucky. The next time I catch you alone, you'll wish to hell you'd left town when you had the chance." The sheriff kept his eyes on the sky as he walked away, but Dee didn't give the lawman so much as a glance. When the hunter finally did raise his face, the flapping shapes coming down from above could clearly be made out as birds. A siren stuttered to life like a suffocating person gasping for air. People bolted into the residential sector, stumbling along in their haste. Dee stood up. A flock of predatory birds was on the attack. Ordinarily, these vicious monsters flew at altitudes of 6,000 feet or more, and fed on the air beasts and flying jellyfish that lived at that height. But when food became scarce, they'd come closer to Earth. The larger ones had wingspans of over 60 feet. They could even carry off a giant cyclops. But the most frightening thing about them was that they didn't act alone, but rather always attacked in flocks of dozens. To their starving eyes, the moving town must have looked like one tremendous meal for the taking. In the distance, the chatter of what sounded like machine gun fire started. Streaks of flame rose to meet the approaching shapes. A black curtain swiftly fell over the streets. Around Dee, the stand of trees bent backward from the intense pressure of the wind. And giving a stomach-churning caw, a bird with a wingspan of over 15 feet swooped down like it was going to land right on top of Dee. Resembling a short horn, its beak was filled with nail-like teeth. Between wings beating incessantly with gale-force winds, clawed feet were visible. 3 digits as thick as tree roots went for Dee, hoping to catch him in their iron grip. Silvery light flashed out. Though the hunter's blade only seemed to paint a single arc, the colossal bird's wings were both cut down the middle, and fresh blood gushed from the creature's throat. The water spreading from the fountain was instantly dyed red. As Dee leapt away from the massive beast's falling corpse, other talons reached for him. Leaving only the crunch of severed bone in his wake, he slashed a gigantic leg off at the root. A shrill scream filled the air. Dee turned around. Under a slowly rising pair of wings some 15 feet away, he saw a desperately struggling figure. It was a little girl in a long skirt. Dee ran directly under her and her captor. His left hand went into action. Leaving a white trail in its wake, the needle he hurled pierced the colossal bird at the base of its throat. And giving a shriek, the creature stopped flapping its wings and began losing altitude at an alarming rate. A second later, Dee's expression changed. In an instant everything around him was black, as a hitherto unseen bird of prey with an enormous 65-foot wingspan swooped down on the bird that had the girl, sank its claws into the base of the other bird's back, and started to rise again. The monstrous bird flapped its wings, and a tremendous shockwave hit the ground. Trees snapped, and the fountain's geyser blew horizontally. One after another, the window panes of every house around the park shattered. The hem of Dee's coat shielded his face. Was that all it took to negate the gale-force winds coming off the monstrous bird? Though the winds buffeted him, Dee's posture didn't change in the least as he stood his ground. When the avian monstrosity lifted its wings a second time, Dee kicked off the ground with incredible force. Flying almost straight up, he rose over 15 feet. His extended left hand latched onto the ankle of the massive bird the other was carrying. Having taken a deadly blow to a vital spot, the lower bird was already dead, and the girl it had captured had fainted. Using his left hand as a fulcrum, Dee swung his body like a pendulum. In midair, his coat opened and, adjusting for wind resistance, Dee sailed skillfully onto the back of the larger bird. The avian monstrosity roared. The harsh cry was not that of a bird, but of a vicious carnivore. Holding his sword point down, Dee raised the weapon high above his head. All at once the wings of the monstrous bird swept back. Quivering, they gave off intense vibrational waves. The bird-like monstrosity's back became semi-transparent. The agony of having a needle driven through each and every cell in his body assailed the hunter. Dee's brow knit ever so slightly. That was his only reaction. The long sword he swiftly brought down pierced the monstrous bird right through the medulla oblongata. A howl of pain shook the sky, and when it ended, the breakup began. The creature's death throes must have turned the vibrations against its own anatomy, because every last feather came out of its wings, and its skin and flesh cracked like drying clay. In the blink of an eye, the monstrous bird of prey was reduced to numerous chunks of meat spread across the sky. All this took place at an altitude of 650 feet. Together, Dee and the little girl fell from the sky. Page break indicated by a small cross. All told, it took the town 2 hours to fight off the birds of prey. Afterward, traces of the battle remained. Bright blood ran down the streets. Several buildings had their roofs blown away by the wind pressure, and a boy who'd picked up a still-hot anti-aircraft shell cried out in pain. The faces of the people were unexpectedly bright. There had been no fatalities. Hardly anyone had been wounded either. A few people had received minor cuts from glass blown out of the windows, but that was the extent of the injuries. What's more, the food situation in town had started to show signs of improvement. The smaller birds of prey were being loaded onto carts and hauled away, while men with axes and chainsaws gathered around the gigantic carcasses that filled the streets. The whine of motors mixed with sounds of meat and bones being severed, and here and there the stench of blood pervaded the town. In less than 30 minutes, a huge bird with a 30-foot wingspan could be stripped down to the point it was no longer recognizable. After all, man-eating birds were delicious, even to the very people they intended to eat. The town was bustling with activity. Carts were laden with piles of meat, viscera, feathers, and bones to be hauled away. All of them would be sent to the factories for chemical processing, with some of the meat being preserved and sent to warehouses for storage. The rest would circulate to the butcher shops and turn up on dinner tables this very night. In the factories waited men with various skills at their disposal. Spears could be made from some of the bones, tendons, and viscera could be used for bowstrings, and the rest of the skeleton would be pulverized to make a paste to be delivered to the hospital. Even the sharp fangs could be turned into accessories. and the blood had its uses as well. Trace amounts of it would probably be mixed in juice, or in their nightly drinks at the bar. And the blood of birds of prey had been proven to have an invigorating effect on humans. Among all of the bustling activity, a mother suddenly noticed her daughter was missing. Seeing her dashing all over town like a woman possessed as she called out the girl's name, other folks finally realized they hadn't seen the woman's only child anywhere. As someone tried to soothe the half-crazed mother, one of her friends answered that her daughter had been headed for the park. And there was every reason to suspect the girl might have met her end at the talons of the colossal birds. Several people started to dash down the street, but quickly stopped in their tracks. From the opposite direction came a beautiful yet foreboding young man. And by his side was a slight figure. The woman called out the little girl's name and ran to her. As the mother and child shared a tearful embrace, Dee turned and walked away without giving them so much as a glance. Where was he going? After the mother had brushed the little girl's hair away from her neck and confirmed there wasn't a mark on her, a relieved smile swept over her face.
"Didn't do nothing to you now, did he?" said one man. "He's a dampier, you know."
Everyone muttered their shared sentiments at that.
"He saved me."
The little girl mumbled.
"Saved you? From what?" "A bird got me. Carried me way up into the sky."
"You're talking nonsense.
Nothing like that fell in the park." "But it's true,"
the little girl said absent-mindedly.
"We were falling from the sky, and then he saved me. He really did save me."
The eyes of the townsfolk sought the young hunter, but they could no longer find the faintest trace of him on the noisy street. Chapter 2. End.